The cruelest rejection isn't loud, it's when someone erases you like you were never meant to exist. The crystal chandeliers of the Grand Aurora Ballroom shimmered in gold, casting a soft, almost sacred glow across the sea of tailored tuxedos and silk gowns, and at the center of it all stood Naomi Brooks in a red dress that caught the light like fire, a quiet symbol of a love she still believed in, her fingers gently brushing the edge of her wedding ring as if anchoring herself to something real, something unbreakable, while across the room Ethan Caldwell, billionaire, visionary, the man who had once looked at her like she was the only truth in a world of illusions, adjusted his cufflinks with the same precision he used to close billion-dollar deals, his expression calm, distant, unreadable, and when his gaze finally met hers it wasn't warmth that crossed his eyes but calculation, the kind that stripped emotion down to nothing more than inconvenience, and Naomi felt it then. A shift so subtle yet so final it echoed louder than any storm, the music softened, conversations blurred. And for a moment the entire room seemed to hold its breath as Ethan stepped forward, not toward her but past her, his arm extending to another woman whose polished smile fit seamlessly into his world, a world Naomi had spent years trying to belong to without ever losing herself, and when the whispers began they weren't loud, just enough to cut, just enough to remind her that she had always been the question mark in a sentence he was now rewriting. Ethan's voice followed, low, controlled, devastating in its simplicity as he addressed the room with the authority of a man who had never been told no. Some mistakes, he said, pausing just long enough for every eye to turn, are meant to be corrected, and though he never raised his voice, though he never pointed, Naomi understood with a clarity that felt almost merciful. This was his correction, this was his way of rewriting the narrative without her in it. The silence that followed was heavier than any accusation, thicker than any insult, and yet she did not cry, she did not speak. She simply stood there as the golden light that once felt warm now felt cold against her skin, her reflection caught briefly in the mirrored wall behind him, a woman poised, composed, and already disappearing from a life she had once built with quiet devotion, and then, slowly, deliberately, Naomi reached for her clutch, her movements measured, elegant, as if every second she remained was a choice she refused to make twice. Her heels clicked softly against the marble floor as she turned, each step away from him lighter than the last, not because it didn't hurt but because she refused to let that pain define the final image of her. And as she passed through the towering doors into the cool night air of Manhattan, the city stretched before her, vast, indifferent, full of possibilities she had never allowed herself to imagine without him. And only then did her hand drift to her abdomen, a small, almost unconscious gesture, as if protecting something the world had not yet earned the right to see, her breath steady, her eyes clear, and though behind her the ballroom continued to glow with the illusion of perfection, Naomi Brooks walked into the darkness carrying a truth that would one day return to the light, and shatter everything he thought he had won. The city did not stop for heartbreak, it never did, and as Naomi Brooks stepped onto the empty sidewalk beneath the towering glass facade of the Grand Aurora Ballroom, the hum of late-night traffic and distant sirens folded around her like a reminder that the world kept moving even when something inside you had come to a complete and silent end. The cool Manhattan air brushed against her bare shoulders but she did not shiver. She stood still for a moment, just long enough to feel the weight of what had happened settle into something solid, something real, and then she exhaled slowly as if releasing the last piece of a life that no longer belonged to her. Her phone buzzed once inside her clutch, Ethan's name lighting up the screen. A reflex of control rather than concern, she looked at it for exactly 3 seconds before turning the screen dark again. Not anger, not sadness, just clarity, the kind that came when illusions finally ran out of places to hide. A black car pulled up to the curb, summoned hours ago for a celebration that would never happen. The driver stepped out and opened the door with practiced politeness, but Naomi shook her head gently, her voice calm, almost distant as she said she would walk. Because for the first time in years she needed to feel every step, every block, every inch of distance between who she had been and who she was about to become. The red dress moved with her like a memory that refused to fade, catching reflections from storefront windows as she passed, each one showing her a different version of herself, the devoted wife, the hopeful partner, the woman who believed love was enough to stand beside power, and then finally, the one she barely recognized yet could not look away from. The woman who had just been erased in a room full of people and had chosen silence instead of breaking. Somewhere between Fifth Avenue and Madison, she stopped beneath a streetlight, the golden glow softer now, more honest than the ballroom's artificial brilliance, and her hand instinctively returned to her abdomen, this time lingering, not out of fear but out of something steadier, something rooted, Earlier that morning the doctor's voice had been gentle, almost careful as he explained what the test results meant. A new life, fragile, unseen, already carrying a future Naomi had not yet imagined. She had planned to tell Ethan that night. Had imagined his reaction in 100 different ways, none of them like this. A faint smile touched her lips, not from joy but from the quiet irony of timing. Life did not wait for perfect moments. It arrived exactly when it chose. And now the truth existed without his permission, without his approval, without his name attached to it. A taxi slowed beside her but she waved it off, continuing forward with measured steps, each one more certain than the last. Above her the skyscrapers stretched into the night sky, symbols of ambition and control, of men like Ethan who believed they could shape everything around them. But Naomi understood something different now, something deeper. Control was not power, not the kind that lasted. Real power was the ability to walk away without needing to be seen, without needing to be understood. Her phone buzzed again, a message this time. She did not read it. She did not need to. Whatever words he had chosen would belong to the man who had stood under those chandeliers and rewritten their story as if she had never mattered. But Naomi was no longer part of that version. By the time she reached the corner, the red light shifted to green and she crossed without hesitation, blending into the rhythm of the city, another silhouette among millions. Except she was not invisible, not anymore. She was carrying something that would one day turn silence into truth, absence into consequence. And tonight, as the echoes of a life she once believed in faded behind her, Naomi Brooks did not look back, because the woman who had entered that ballroom no longer existed, and the one who walked away had just begun her story. Morning arrived without ceremony, a pale wash of light slipping through the narrow blinds of a modest one-bedroom apartment Naomi had rented before her life had been rewritten in marble and glass. The space felt smaller than she remembered yet more honest, every surface carrying the quiet weight of reality instead of illusion. She stood by the window in a borrowed sweatshirt, her red dress folded carefully over the back of a chair like a relic from a different lifetime, her reflection faint against the glass, softer now, stripped of everything that had once defined her role beside a man who measured worth in status and silence. The city below moved with its usual precision, coffee carts opening, taxis weaving through traffic, people stepping into their routines without hesitation, and Naomi watched it all with a stillness that was no longer fragile but deliberate. Her phone lay untouched on the kitchen counter. Notifications stacked one over another, missed calls, messages. Fragments of a world trying to reach her too late. She did not need to read them to understand their tone. Control disguised as concern, authority mistaken for connection. She poured herself a glass of water instead, the simple act grounding her in a way luxury never had. Her hand steady as she placed it against her abdomen once more, not questioning now, not wondering, only acknowledging. The doctor's words echoed again, not as a shock but as a quiet truth that had already begun to reshape her thinking. A new life meant a new direction, and for the first time the future did not revolve around fitting into someone else's empire. It unfolded in front of her like an uncharted path she alone would define. The sunlight shifted, warming the hardwood floor, and Naomi moved with it, gathering the few belongings she had left behind. Years ago, documents, a framed photograph she turned face down without hesitation, a pair of shoes she no longer recognized as part of herself, each item a decision, each choice a quiet declaration that she would not carry unnecessary weight into what came next. Somewhere in the distance a church bell rang, marking the hour with a clarity that felt almost symbolic. Time had moved forward whether she was ready or not, and now she was choosing to move with it. Her phone buzzed again, this time persistent. She walked toward it slowly, not with urgency but with intention, her fingers hovering over the screen before finally picking it up. Ethan's name stared back at her, followed by a single message that read, "We need to talk." The words simple, controlled, as if the previous night had been a business adjustment rather than a fracture that could not be undone. Naomi read it once, then again, not searching for meaning but confirming what she already knew. There was nothing left to negotiate, nothing left to explain. She set the phone down without replying. The silence that followed was not empty, it was full of choice, full of direction, full of a strength that had not existed 24 hours ago. She reached for her coat, slipping it on with calm precision, and as she stepped toward the door she paused just long enough to take in the room one last time, not with nostalgia but with recognition. This was where she would begin again, not as someone abandoned but as someone who had chosen to leave. The distinction mattered now, more than anything, and as she opened the door and stepped into the hallway, the world did not change, the lights remained the same, the air carried the same quiet hum of everyday life. but Naomi Brooks had already shifted into something else entirely, something that did not need permission, something that did not wait to be chosen, something that would one day return not for revenge but for truth, and this time, she would not be standing in anyone's shadow. The first few weeks did not feel like progress, they felt like endurance, like learning how to breathe in a space that no longer echoed with someone else's expectations. Naomi Brooks moved through her days with a quiet discipline that replaced what had once been routine. Mornings began before sunrise, not out of obligation but intention. She would sit by the window with a cup of black coffee, untouched more often than not, watching the city wake up in layers of motion and sound, reminding herself that life did not pause for anyone and neither would she. The apartment slowly transformed, not through luxury but through clarity. She removed anything that carried the weight of who she had been, replacing it with simplicity, a desk by the window, a notebook filled with structured plans instead of scattered thoughts, a calendar that did not revolve around social appearances but measurable steps forward. Each small decision became a quiet assertion of control, the kind that did not need to be announced, the kind that built something real. Her body changed gradually, subtly at first, a reminder that she was no longer walking alone through this transition. Doctor appointments became part of her new rhythm, each visit grounding her further in the truth she had chosen to protect. The ultrasound screen flickered with movement one afternoon, and for the first time Naomi allowed herself to pause completely, the world outside fading into silence as she watched something so small carry a presence so undeniable. The doctor spoke in calm, reassuring tones, but Naomi was not listening to the details. She was listening to something deeper, something instinctive, a quiet promise forming without words, that whatever came next would not be shaped by fear. She left the clinic that day with a folder in her hand and a steadiness in her step that had nothing to do with certainty and everything to do with resolve. Work became her next foundation, not the curated environments she had once navigated but spaces where results mattered more than perception. She took on consulting projects, small at first, overlooked opportunities that others dismissed, but Naomi approached them with precision. Late nights spent reviewing numbers, building strategies, understanding systems from the inside out. She did not rush recognition, she built competence, the kind that could not be taken away. Weeks turned into months, and slowly her name began to circulate in quieter circles, not as someone attached to power but as someone who created it through consistency, through clarity, through a refusal to be underestimated. There were moments, rare but present, when memories surfaced uninvited, the echo of a voice, the reflection of a past version of herself in a passing window. But they no longer held the same weight, they were reminders, not anchors. One evening, as rain traced soft lines across the glass, her phone lit up again with a number she recognized without needing to check. She watched it ring, the sound steady, persistent, familiar, and for a brief second the past hovered just within reach. But Naomi did not move toward it. She turned the phone face down and returned to her work, her pen moving across the page with calm certainty. Because the life she was building no longer required revisiting the one that had tried to define her. Outside, the rain continued to fall, washing the city in a quiet rhythm, and inside, Naomi Brooks continued forward, not chasing redemption, not seeking validation, but constructing something far more powerful, a future that would one day stand undeniable on its own. And when that day came, it would not be about proving anything to anyone, it would simply be about truth finally being seen. Time did not announce its passing, it revealed itself in details that could not be undone, in the quiet expansion of Naomi Brooks's world and the steady rhythm of a life that no longer waited for permission. Months folded into years with a precision she had once admired in others, now built entirely by her own design. The small consulting projects evolved into long-term contracts, then into partnerships, and eventually into something far more substantial, a firm that carried her name not as decoration but as foundation. Brooks' strategic solutions became known not through loud introductions but through results that spoke with undeniable clarity. Companies sought her insight, not because of who she had been connected to, but because of what she consistently delivered, and Naomi moved through boardrooms with the same calm control she had once carried through silence, only now it was recognized as authority rather than restraint, her presence measured, her words deliberate, each decision anchored in a vision that extended beyond immediate gain. She did not chase attention, yet it found her anyway. Articles began to mention her work, industry panels extended invitations, her name appearing in spaces that once would have questioned her place. But she never lingered on recognition. She understood that visibility was not the same as value, and she chose to build the latter with unwavering focus. At home, her life followed a different rhythm. one that could not be measured in contracts or meetings, the sound of small footsteps across hardwood floors, the soft laughter that filled spaces once defined by silence, the presence of a child who had grown not in the shadow of absence but in the light of intentional love. Naomi balanced both worlds with a precision that felt almost instinctive, mornings that began with quiet routines, afternoons structured around work that demanded excellence, evenings reserved for a life that reminded her why she had chosen this path without compromise. There were moments when exhaustion lingered at the edges, when the weight of responsibility pressed against her composure, but she never allowed it to define her pace. She adjusted, recalibrated, moved forward with the same discipline that had carried her through the earliest days of uncertainty, and as the years unfolded, the distance between who she had been and who she had become grew impossible to ignore, not because she tried to forget, but because she had built something that no longer required comparison, across the city. In a world that still revolved around power and perception, Ethan Caldwell continued to expand his empire with the same relentless drive, acquisitions, mergers, public appearances that reinforced his image as a man who did not lose. Yet behind the carefully maintained structure, there were fractures he did not acknowledge, deals that felt hollow despite their scale, rooms filled with people who admired his success but never challenged his solitude. He moved forward as if the past had been resolved simply because it had been removed from view, unaware that some absences did not fade. They waited, they evolved, they returned when the timing aligned with truth rather than convenience, and on a clear autumn morning, 6 years after a night that had quietly redefined 2 lives, an invitation arrived on Naomi's desk, printed on heavy cream paper with understated elegance, the kind that signaled significance without needing to announce it: the Caldwell Global Annual Summit, a gathering of industry leaders, investors, and decision-makers, a room where influence converged and narratives were shaped. Naomi held the card between her fingers for a moment longer than necessary, her expression unreadable, not because she was uncertain, but because she understood exactly what it represented: not a coincidence, not a simple professional opportunity, but a convergence of timelines that had been moving toward this moment long before either of them realized it. She set the invitation down with calm precision, her reflection faint in the glass surface of her desk, composed, steady, complete, and for the first time in years, the past was not something behind her, it was something she would walk toward on her own terms, not as the woman who had left, but as the one who had built something strong enough to stand in any room without asking to be seen. And this time, the story would not be rewritten without her. Preparation did not begin with the dress, it began with the decision. The quiet moment when Naomi Brooks chose not just to attend the Caldwell Global Annual Summit but to step fully into a space that once defined her absence. The invitation rested on her desk for 3 days. Before she responded, not out of hesitation but precision, every move now intentional, every appearance calculated with a clarity that came from understanding both perception and truth, the morning of the event arrived with a crisp autumn chill, the kind that sharpened the air and carried a sense of transition. Her penthouse overlooked the Hudson, sunlight stretching across polished floors as she stood before a full-length mirror, not searching for approval, not questioning her place, simply acknowledging the woman she had become. The dress she chose was not loud, not designed to command attention through excess. It was deep crimson, structured, elegant, the color carrying history without being defined by it, a quiet echo of a night that had once broken her, now transformed into something else entirely. Her movements were unhurried, deliberate, each detail aligned with the presence she intended to bring into that room. Her phone buzzed softly on the vanity, a notification from her assistant confirming the schedule for the evening, her speaking slot position just before the closing remarks, strategic, visible, undeniable. Naomi glanced at the message and set the phone aside, her focus not on the timeline but on the moment itself. In another room, a small voice called out, light, familiar, grounding. She stepped away from the mirror and into a space that held a different kind of importance. Her son sat at the table with a set of colored pencils scattered around him, his concentration intense as he worked on a drawing that only he fully understood. His features carried a quiet resemblance that Naomi never needed to explain, not to herself, not to anyone. She knelt beside him, smoothing a gentle hand over his curls, her voice calm as she reminded him of the evening routine, the sitter arriving, dinner prepared, everything in place. He looked up at her with a trust so complete it required no words, and for a moment the world outside that apartment ceased to exist. There was no summit, no past, no convergence of timelines, only this, the life she had built, the reason she had never looked back. She pressed a soft kiss to his forehead, not as a farewell but as a promise, and stood with the same quiet strength that defined every decision she made. The car arrived precisely at 6 o'clock, its black exterior reflecting the fading light of the city as it waited below. Naomi took one last look at the space around her, not out of attachment but recognition. This was her foundation. Everything else was simply an extension of it. The drive through Manhattan was smooth, the city alive with its usual rhythm, lights flickering on as dusk settled in, each building carrying its own story, its own ambition, and Naomi watched it all with a composed stillness, not absorbing it, not reacting to it, simply moving through it with purpose. When the car pulled up to the venue, the same towering structure that had once marked the end of something she believed in, there was no hesitation in her step, the entrance illuminated, cameras positioned with quiet anticipation, the air charged with the presence of influence and expectation. She stepped out into the light, the crimson fabric catching the glow in a way that felt intentional rather than symbolic, and as she walked forward, the past did not rush toward her, it aligned itself behind her, exactly where it belonged, because tonight was not about revisiting what had happened, it was about revealing what had been built in its absence. And as the doors opened before her, Naomi Brooks entered not as a memory, not as a shadow, but as a presence that could no longer be overlooked. The ballroom did not change, but everything about it felt different. The same crystal chandeliers cast their golden light across polished marble floors, the same quiet hum of power filled the air, yet when Naomi Brooks stepped inside, the room no longer defined her, it reacted to her. Conversations softened just slightly as her presence registered, not through recognition alone but through something less tangible, a shift in attention that could not be ignored. She moved forward with measured steps, her posture steady, her expression composed, each detail of her appearance aligned with the authority she carried without needing to announce it. The deep crimson of her dress caught the light in subtle waves, not demanding attention but holding it, and for a brief moment the past and present overlapped in a way that almost felt deliberate, the memory of another night, another version of herself standing in this same space. But the comparison ended there, because this time she was not waiting to be acknowledged, she already was. Across the room Ethan Caldwell stood among a circle of investors, his voice low, controlled, the same presence that had built an empire now wrapped in a familiarity that masked the quiet emptiness beneath it. He was mid-sentence when his gaze shifted, not by intention but instinct, something drawing his attention with a force he did not immediately understand, and when his eyes landed on Naomi, the world around him did not stop, but it lost its clarity. The conversation blurred into background noise, the carefully structured environment he commanded momentarily slipping out of alignment. She did not look at him right away, her focus directed toward the host who greeted her with professional warmth, introductions exchanged with ease, her name spoken with a respect that had been earned rather than assumed, and it was only after a few seconds, just long enough to establish the distance between who they had been and who they were now, that Naomi turned her gaze toward him. There was no hesitation, no flicker of uncertainty, only a calm recognition that held no trace of the past he had chosen. Ethan felt it immediately, not as confrontation, not as accusation, but as something far more unsettling, indifference, the kind that did not ask questions, did not seek closure, did not offer him a role in her narrative. He excused himself from the group without finishing his sentence, the movement subtle yet noticeable to those who watched closely, and crossed the room with the same controlled stride that had once defined his confidence. But something about it had shifted, something less certain beneath the surface. When he stopped in front of her, the space between them held more than silence, it held 6 years of absence, of choices, of consequences that had never been revisited. Naomi met his presence without stepping back, without leaning forward, simply standing exactly where she chose to be. Ethan's voice, when it came, was quieter than expected, stripped of the authority he had once used so easily. "Naomi," he said, as if the name itself required adjustment, as if saying it out loud brought with it a weight he had not anticipated. She inclined her head slightly, acknowledging the moment without giving it more than it deserved. "Ethan," her tone even, composed. The exchange brief yet precise, like a transaction that carried no emotional debt. There were questions in his expression, not loud, not demanding, but present, searching for something he could not define, perhaps recognition, perhaps reaction, perhaps the echo of the woman he believed he had left behind. But Naomi offered none of it. She did not fill the silence. She did not explain the years between them. She simply existed in front of him as proof of something he had never accounted for, that what he had dismissed had not disappeared, it had transformed, and before he could speak again, before the past could attempt to reshape the present, the host's voice carried across the room, announcing the next segment of the evening. Naomi's name included in a list of speakers that commanded immediate attention. The shift in focus was instant, heads turning, expectations realigning. And for the first time since he had seen her, Ethan understood that whatever he thought he had control over no longer applied. Naomi gave a small, polite nod, not to him but to the moment itself, and turned toward the stage, her steps steady, unhurried, leaving him standing in a space that suddenly felt unfamiliar, because the woman he had once removed from his world had returned without asking for a place in it, and this time, she did not need one. The stage lights were brighter than the chandeliers, sharper, more honest, casting a focused glow that left no room for illusion, and as Naomi Brooks stepped onto the platform the room shifted its attention entirely, not out of courtesy but expectation, the kind reserved for someone whose presence carried weight beyond reputation. She paused at the center, not to gather herself but to allow the silence to settle, a controlled stillness that drew every eye toward her without a single word spoken, her posture aligned, her expression composed, and when she began to speak her voice was calm, steady, measured with the precision of someone who understood not just what to say but when to say it. She spoke of strategy, of systems that outlasted trends, of building foundations that did not depend on visibility but on value. Her words carried clarity rather than performance, each sentence deliberate, each pause intentional, and the audience responded not with distraction but with focus, leaning in, absorbing, recognizing substance over spectacle. Across the room Ethan Caldwell stood still, his attention fixed not on the content but on the presence delivering it. Every detail of her composure contradicted the narrative he had once believed. There was no trace of the uncertainty he had dismissed, no echo of the woman he had erased, only control, only clarity, only something he could not redefine to fit his understanding. The applause came not as a reaction but as a recognition, sustained, genuine, filling the space with a resonance that lingered even after she stepped away from the podium. But it was not the applause that shifted the evening. It was what followed, as the next segment began. A presentation screen illuminated behind her, a visual summary of her firm's recent work, data points, projections, partnerships displayed with clean precision, and then, almost seamlessly, a slide appeared that did not follow the expected pattern, an image, simple, understated, a photograph that did not belong to the language of business, a child standing beside a window, sunlight framing his small silhouette, his features clear, unmistakable in their quiet resemblance. The room did not react immediately. It took a moment, a second longer than usual for understanding to move through perception, but when it did, it spread with a subtle shift in attention, eyes moving from the screen back to Naomi, searching, questioning without speaking, and in that moment she did not rush to explain. She allowed the silence to hold its place, controlled, intentional. Before she spoke again, her voice unchanged, steady as before, she did not raise it, did not dramatize what she was about to reveal. She simply stated it as truth. 6 years ago, she said, I left this room with nothing but a decision, and a future that did not yet have a name. Her gaze did not waver, not toward the audience, not toward the screen, and not toward Ethan, though his presence was now undeniably part of the moment. Today, she continued, that future stands on its own, not as a consequence of loss, but as a result of choice. She did not elaborate further, did not assign blame, did not seek reaction, because the truth required no decoration. It existed fully in its own form. The image behind her remained, silent, undeniable, and Ethan felt it then, not as shock, not as anger, but as something far more destabilizing, recognition, the kind that arrived too late to be redirected. The details aligned in his mind with a clarity that left no space for denial. The timeline, the absence, the silence he had accepted without question, and for the first time in years, control slipped not in a visible way, not in a way the room could easily detect, but in something internal, something that shifted his understanding of everything he had chosen not to see. Naomi concluded without emphasis, without seeking a response, her final words returning to the language of her work, her focus unchanged, as if the revelation had been nothing more than a continuation of the same truth she had been presenting all along. And as she stepped away from the stage, once more, the room did not erupt. It absorbed, it processed, it recalibrated, because what had just been revealed was not a disruption, it was a correction, one that did not ask for attention but demanded recognition. And as Naomi Brooks walked back into the quiet current of the evening, she did not look back, because the moment had already done what it needed to do. It had spoken without raising its voice, and the truth, once seen, could not be unseen. The room did not return to what it had been before. It shifted into something quieter, heavier, as if every conversation now carried an awareness that had not existed an hour ago. Naomi Brooks moved through it without pause, without seeking reaction. Her presence no longer part of the spectacle but something far more controlled. She stopped briefly to exchange a few words with industry leaders, her tone consistent, her focus unchanged, as if nothing extraordinary had occurred, and in many ways it had not, because truth, when delivered with clarity, did not need to announce itself, it simply settled into place. Across the room Ethan Caldwell remained still for longer than anyone would have expected, the kind of stillness that did not belong to him, his mind assembling pieces he had ignored for 6 years, the absence of questions, the silence he had mistaken for closure, the night he had rewritten without considering what had been left unsaid, and now the answer stood in front of him, not as accusation, not as confrontation, but as reality that could not be negotiated. When he finally moved, it was not with the confidence that once defined him, but with a measured pace that revealed something unfamiliar, hesitation. He found her near the edge of the ballroom, where the light softened and the noise thinned into a distant hum. Naomi stood by the window, the city stretching out beyond her, lights reflecting across the glass like a quiet constellation. She did not turn when he approached, not out of avoidance but because she did not need to acknowledge his presence to feel it. Ethan stopped beside her, the distance between them deliberate, controlled, his voice lower now, stripped of performance. "Naomi," he said again, but this time her name carried weight he could not mask. She turned slowly, meeting his gaze with the same calm precision she had held all evening. There was no tension in her expression, no trace of resentment, only clarity, and that unsettled him more than anything else could have. "I did not know," he said, the words simple, insufficient, the kind that arrived too late to hold meaning. Naomi listened without interruption, not because she was waiting for explanation, but because she understood the moment for what it was, not reconciliation, not apology, but recognition. "You did not ask," she replied, her voice even, not sharp, not accusing, just true. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was final. Ethan looked at her as if searching for something more, a response, a reaction, a possibility that still remained open. But Naomi had already made her decision long before this moment existed. "There are things you cannot return to," she continued, her gaze steady, not unkind but unyielding, not because they are lost, but because they were never valued when they were present. Ethan inhaled slowly, the words settling deeper than he expected, and for the first time in his life, there was nothing he could offer that would change the outcome, not influence, not success, not control. Naomi stepped back slightly, creating a space that clarified everything without needing further explanation. Her hand moved briefly to her side, a familiar gesture now, one that carried meaning far beyond what could be spoken in that room. "He deserves a life built on truth," she said quietly, not as a revelation but as a boundary, "and I have already given him that." Ethan's gaze faltered, not visibly, not in a way the world would notice, but enough for him to understand what he had not just lost, but what he had never allowed himself to see. Naomi inclined her head once, a gesture of closure rather than farewell, and turned toward the exit, her step steady, unhurried, the same quiet rhythm that had carried her through every stage of her transformation. The doors opened before her, the night air cool and grounding as she stepped back into the city that had witnessed both her fall and her rise. Behind her, the ballroom remained filled with light, with voices, with the ongoing motion of a world that would continue unchanged. But for Ethan Caldwell, something had shifted in a way that could not be undone, because the woman he had once dismissed had returned not to reclaim anything, but to reveal what she had built without him. And as Naomi Brooks walked forward into the night, her reflection merging with the endless movement of the city, there was no need for revenge, no need for closure, because the truth had already done what it always does. It had drawn a line between what was lost and what was chosen, and on one side stood everything she had become, unshaken, undeniable, and entirely her own.